Welcome to StoryTalk, a roundtable discussion of a single story at a time. StoryTalk is a production of One Week Critique, an Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our Patreon page or by going to our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number oneweekcritique.com. I'm Adam al-Sirgany, here today with Matthew Schmidt.
Hello.
And Ingrid Wenzler.
Hi.
Today we'll be discussing Testimony and Pilot by Barry Hannah, which is the third and longest story in Hannah's infamous 1978 collection, Airships. Testimony and Pilot is an account written by William. William is a Mississippi ad man who's made himself deaf drumming in a jazz and rock band, the Bop Fiends. This is only a part of the narrative, however. The better portion of this work is about William's relationship to his friend Ard Quadberry. Quadberry is a curious, reclusive child with a drunk father who holds a PhD in history and a mother whose attributes are a little amorphous. Quadberry himself is a saxophone prodigy, or has become one already by the age of 11 with force of effort, and it's Quadberry's efforts and intensities will follow throughout much of this story. They will carry Quadberry from being a sax player to being a naval fighter pilot during the Vietnam War, and eventually, if indirectly, to his death. So much happens in this story, and despite my summary's inferences, so much of it is so funny. I'd rather dig into the lines than waste too much time summarizing. But is there anything else folks ought to know before we get started with our discussion today?
You know, Adam, I think it's such a sprawling story that to try to cover it all would also be a fool's errand, maybe just getting into it and finding our way to the specifics that way.
Yeah. I think, as always, I encourage anyone listening to dig on these stories before or after, whatever works best for you. So when we meet Quadberry, he is emerging from his house, which William and William's friend Radcliffe have taken to shooting flashlight batteries at. They use a kind of makeshift cannon constructed from a pipe and M80s, which are a firecracker. They have intended to take revenge on a man William saw slaughter a pig, which deeply upset William, but instead they've accidentally attacked the Quadberry house. So can the two of you lay out this incident a little bit and speak to its significance, not only in establishing Quadberry and the sort of scene of the story, but in laying out the world that Clinton, Mississippi is at the time the story's set?
Yeah, I think it's such a careful, intentional opening in that, we're always in the narrator, William's perspective, but what we find out most immediately is about the setting, but not just the setting, very broadly. We find out the particulars of the setting that William would have been paying attention to at that time, and the particulars of the setting as they relate to what's about to happen. We learn about this backyard of a 3-story wooden house that his father had bought and rented out, and we understand it as a place with a different potential for play. So that's an example of how, we're inhabiting character in that way. We also learn that it's not the country, it's town. So we get these different differentiations, and they have a kind of flux in terms of age. Like, we get that thought about play because that's really relevant to William's perspective at that time and how he's thinking about that space. But the narration is retrospective, so I imagine him not having to think so much about this was not country at that time as a young boy. We get a lay for the land, and we get a sense of where the tin roof house is that they strike, the kind of distance and the ways in which that might be confused with other houses around. In terms of Quadberry, what we get... Actually, let me take a step back, because I think it's important to kind of first articulate what happens and then follow the story's order and then come to Quadberry. So what these two boys do, William and Radcliffe, yeah,
How I think of it.
is they take this contraption of theirs and they shoot flashlight batteries at a house. They mistake the house. They think it's one. They're looking through their binoculars, but it's another. And what's so significant about this, I think it's one of the best sort of drive-by racially charged scenes I've ever encountered. Partly because in just a line, it really smartly articulates where biases and racisms can come from at a young age.
Sure.
The line that we get is, "Because of that scene, I considered Negroes savage cowards for a good 5 more years of my life." What is the scene? I'm getting ahead of myself. So the scene is seeing black men and a pig, and the pig is hit with an axe on top of its head and killed that way. One of those men is believed to be drunk, and the narrator, William, sees this and is just horrified at what's been done to the animal, and as a result, because he sees black men doing this, assumes that, this is a racial problem.
Right.
So, I mean, what the reason they end up shooting these flashlight batteries is to get revenge. And, this slowly unfolds in this really lovely way in the story, and is very funny as it's told as well. But, I mean, I think the really smart thing about that line is it helps us sympathize with William's older self, in that by tagging the good 5 more years of my life, it suggests that the time has ended for him, that he doesn't any longer think that way.
Yeah, and I think it interestingly launches us into, the kind of social experiences that he's having that lead him, to your point, it throws us back onto that and why he comes to that conclusion, right, as a totalizing racial conclusion rather than a conclusion that's just I don't like when people kill pigs,
right?
And that he's going to have to encounter that over time. But yeah, I think that is it's a wild and intense drive-by, but I don't want to ramble on.
Yeah, I'll let Matthew chime in with how Quadberry enters in, and I'll chime back as wanted and needed.
So they don't end up actually attacking the house of that man. They end up attacking Quadberry's house.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is that Quadberry's house is situated apparently just on the side of some railroad tracks, and is between the white and black parts of town. It is also notably a lone house, it's by itself, and seemingly small, because it has a tin roof, and, these batteries are making dents in the tin roof. I think the whole situation is the Quadberries are out on their own, in a way, and solitary kind of beings, though his parents work.
Yeah.
And the reason Quadberry gets involved is that his father is drunk and has a headache and, would have come out himself could he fathom and move out there to yell at or chastise or, in Quadberry's words, use a fire poker to beat them with. Instead, we get Quadberry, who has been apparently practicing his saxophone in the garage, coming across this cornfield and asking them to stop shooting the batteries at them because he's getting flack for it by association.
Yeah.
And he does, it's a weird introduction, but Quadberry is generally a curious person, and in the way of like how things work. And so he wants to know how this contraption that they've set up is operating. And Radcliffe at first is adamant that he not show Quadberry how this happens, and then says, well, if you'll play your horn, we'll show you, And so, Quadberry does prepare to play his horn. And, maybe this is like one of the funniest things, if I can find it.
Mm.
Oh, yeah, here we go. Quadberry began sucking and licking the reed. I didn't care much for this act, and there was too much desperate oralness in his face when he began playing. That was why I chose the drums. One had to engage himself, like Suck's Revenge with a horn. But what Quadberry was playing was pleasant and intricate. I was sure it was advanced, and there was no squawking, as from the other 11-year-olds on sax in the band room. He made the end with a clean, upward riff, holding the final note high, pure, and unwavering. Right, so it's a strange introduction, and then Quadberry plays an amazing something, lick or little piece on the saxophone. And William's like, yeah, man, that was good. And Radcliffe, basically starts making fun of Quadberry, saying it sounded like a duck, and then throws an M80 surrounded by mud over towards Quadberry, who is then both splattered with mud and possibly hit with shrapnel of some sort that hits him like in the cheek by the eye, and he starts bleeding. And that's like the end scene. And William says, I didn't talk to him for like another I don't know, decade or something like that.
Yeah, it's several years.
I think they're 11, and he says doesn't speak to William until 18,
Yeah.
so 7 years.
So,
And, I think one of the most telling things about the mud bomb is that Quadberry gives up his body to protect the mouthpiece of the horn, because he knows somehow that is more important than his body, which is a weird thing at 11 years old.
Oh, it's a wild, weird thing. And I mean, it's one of my favorite things about not only this story of Hannah's, but Hannah in his entirety. There's so many things that feel a little like useless asides that do so much work in that way, where the setup itself, our last story talk was on Amy Bender, who also does this tremendously well, lays out a setup that's so bizarre, but also that ends up giving us an opportunity to think about the character, and then through significant details offers other things up, right? Like sometimes like symbolism gets to me, but like the scar being like an upturned crown on his eye as he does that thing protecting the mouthpiece, like blows my mind. But also just like that sidebar of, right, like at 11 you might know that you're like a little grossed out by watching someone play the saxophone, and maybe I like, as a sax player, like feel sensitive about this or something, but like the idea of desperate oralness is such a like specific, but I see it in my head so tremendously well.
The other thing about The Crown is that the reader, we get to see it immediately, even though they don't, because Quadberry leaves with what William thinks his eye is bleeding.
Yeah.
So they only see this in retrospect, but it's like the compression of time takes place in like a couple of lines, and yet then it lengthens throughout the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd add that in terms of Quadberry, I paid a lot of attention to like what he says in this early scene.
For sure.
And, he seems to be repeating language that he's gotten from an adult in his life. I don't know if it's the mother or the father that describes his father's hangover as a headache from indiscretion, but that's not an 11-year-old's language. And he's curious about what those guys are up to. He asks about the batteries.
Yeah.
And I think it also, even though he's injured in this kind of extreme and absurd way, I think it says a lot about who he is as a young person, that he doesn't want to speak to them and wants to, continue to hold a grudge around that.
Yeah. I think that before we leave this, I also, I'm fascinated with the logistics, and I think that there's something that I immediately empathize with about Quadberry, and thinking about that, which I think is, Quadberry is a little bit of a mysterious character, and so I think giving that opportunity about curiosity, I had a lot of interactions with M80s as a child, and which probably speaks to my own having too much room to mess around outside, but the sort of logistics of how all this works, and the my adult self going that's horrifyingly dangerous to put an explosive into a tube and then also take the time to drop a battery in and run away.
How is Radcliffe described as a radical experimental chemist, something like that.
Violent.
Yeah.
Experimental chemist.
Those adjectives are so sharp. I also just want to add that this story, I'm blanking on the pub date now, but wasn't one that would have gotten a sensitivity read, and in terms of describing the geography of this space, and in other places in the story, the N-word is used.
Yeah, quite a bit across Hannah. While I'd encourage reading him, that element of him is...
I just think it's worth noting.
Yeah, definitely of its time and locale,
mm-hmm.
As the most I can say for that. Anyway, Hannah is writing out of his characters who are in that time and locale, and in this case, we actually find out that William's physically writing this story down, which is
mm-hmm.
important not only because his job ends up being writing, but because he's also he's deaf, he's not communicating, and he's a little shy about that in some places. The way he writes it is actually really interesting to me, in that it's an interweaving that feels to me both realistic to how he interacts with Quadberry, but also as a story allows us to see those two characters, William's development and Quadberry out in his vacuum on the edge of town, are separated. They have, despite being close enough to launch a flashlight battery at his house, they don't see each other for 7 years, as you noted in. So I think William's development is a little unimpressive in some ways, right? We come to learn that he's very dedicated to the drums and to impressing women, but he comes off as a little bit unimpressive for that, or a little bit immature for that. But the first, maybe most significant example of that interweaving coming together between the battery cannon and their next encounter happens when the high school band director, whose name is Prender, he's going to come up a lot, announces that the high school band is getting this genius sax player who's been off to band camps somewhere in, I believe, Vermont or something. It's supposed to be very impressive. And the band, which is done very, very well at the last state competition, is going to play Maurice Ravel's Bolero. So I'd like to get into Bolero, Prender, and the high school lives of these boys. And I'm hoping that we can speak a little bit to that weaving and why the story ends up doing that. beyond just the literalness of them not always being in the same place.
Well, I mean, I think first off, Bolero, as we just listened to a section, is a very long piece and heavy on the drumming. The drums do kind of like give it this march quality.
Yeah.
And this is why William loves it, because he gets to kind of dictate the pace as leading the percussion section. And, you know, the next time that William kind of claims that they talk is one time when he comes to the band room, because he likes to practice or hang around in the band room at times, and he sees a younger high school student calling Quadberry Queerberry, and Quadberry pummeling the young kid over and over. And, you know, William's like, what is going on here? And, you know, Quadberry tells him, even though William's witnessed this. And, you know, William's like, why do you care what this kid says about you? And Quadberry's response is, I care. And, you know, that's kind of left right there. And we move more into the journey to performing Bolero.
Yeah.
But I think we're going to come back to that a little bit. I think as far as the weaving goes, some of it has to do with the fact that this is a testimony, right? It's called Testimony of Pilate. And, you know, William's recalling what he remembers from, you know, X years ago. We don't exactly know how many years ago we're talking, but it's probably at least like 10 to 30 at this point.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the one thing that's going to be true is that he's not going to remember everything necessarily in order. He's only, you know, he's going to remember the things that really stick out to him, and he's going to tell them in the way that he thinks they happened, or as he imagines they happened. So, you know, that's one thing. I think another thing, I suppose, is while he's not necessarily enamored with Quadberry at the beginning, or at least in high school, he does think of Quadberry as this different kind of kid.
Yeah.
And so part of this interweaving seems to like build the mythos of Quadberry. And, you know, why is he so good on saxophone? Why is he the way he is and caring like whether this boy thinks he's queer or not?
Yeah.
You know, what's the deal with his family living in this, you know, shack by the railroad all alone, though his father has a doctorate and teaches at the local college?
Yeah.
You know, and so there's that happening. And I think with Bolero, right, being a really long piece, there's like this thing where it's mimicking Bolero in how like different little passages come in, but the same theme is like continually hammered on you.
Yeah.
And I think that is a really interesting thing to consider, insofar as like William's going to tell the drum portion, or like all the bass line of the story is coming from William, and kind of he uses Quadberry as like the melody at times.
Yeah.
Where Quadberry actually speaks for himself, or like Quadberry does this, Quadberry does that. And like it comes in and goes out. And sometimes it's just like William being like, well, and this is what I did, and this is what I did. At other times, it's like Quadberry soloing, and, you know, making the story really interesting, because somehow it uplifts William, who at this point is deaf and living a pretty banal life as an ad writer.
Yeah.
And so like this is like him being like, man, Quadberry was a really interesting dude, and I liked him, and I can't necessarily explain everything, but like this is what was cool about Quadberry.
Yeah, I like that metaphor. It's not one I had necessarily thought of, but there is. I mean, it's bolero for those who don't know it. Uh, listen to some of it, but the drum part is. I mean, it's like triplet one, and like over and over and over for a lot of the piece. I mean, it's very much holding it down in that way, and I think that is interesting to think about the metaphor of William being that dude for Quadberry, who of course is coming in very specifically to solo into this piece and like is being brought into that conversation.
Yeah, I guess I'd add that I think because of other things I've been reading, I've been thinking a lot about literature in sort of filmic terms, and I think one thing I notice about the interweaving between the two, and initially their friend Radcliffe is also in that rotation, is that almost like montage, it sets up a comparison and you start thinking about the different pace at which these boys are developing and the differences between their attitudes toward music, toward women, toward you name it. Um, and, I mean, I think, like Matthew's saying, it also gives you a sense of their particular friendship over time and stresses Quadberry as the kind of not only the star of Bolero, metaphorically, but the star of this story, the character that's being paid attention to, whose personality is being puzzled out and remembered. Um, I think in terms of like examples of what their world's like in high school, that does change for them over time. So I mean, in terms of that 7-year span of time, it's not that they never see each other. What the narrator says about that time is that he's really avoidant of Quadberry, that he's, pursuing women, and even when he's really with a woman who he's feeling good about or a young girl, he will like duck away if Quadberry sees him. That both he and Radcliffe have guilt about what they did to Quadberry, but this sort of, especially on the narrator's part, attention to what Quadberry's up to, and it's interesting to see how that attention changes over time. At first, there's that avoidance and ducking away, and then when Quadberry takes, I'm not a music person, so forgive my like confused language around this, but like I guess first seat in the performance, first chair. The narrator feels annoyed at that at first. He's like thinking of himself as keeping hold of the taste among the whole percussion section, and he thinks about how the other sax player, who's until that point been first chair, might feel. So it's not this like, and Quadberry's here for him at first.
Yeah.
That comes later.
Yeah, I think it's especially interesting because, right, like, I think for two things, or in two ways, right? Like, one is what you're saying, Ingrid, that, like, this is a high school symphonic band, and, like, so there isn't, right, like, that kind of first chair and, like, holding down a lockdown position in order to execute a lockdown part, or at least insofar as it's written, you're playing the piece, you're going through that, right, to, like, bring someone up as a star who's going to accentuate something, is, I think, a little disconcerting in the way that it is to, like, have any job or position in life to feel like you're working toward doing something, and then because someone else's talent, like, gets recognized above yours, that, like, that feeling of that, I think that also speaks to what Matthew's talking about. I think, because my own experience, I'm very, like, immersed in the stories of jazz musicians, and, like, if you read, like, Miles Davis's autobiography, in some ways it's this story of, like, striving to be the best, like, trumpet player of all time, and that striving begins very early on of, like, I want to be this, I want to be this, I want to be this. And, like, you see him when he gets to someone like John Coltrane, who hasn't left that kind of autobiographical testament about his life, right? Like sometimes aggravated with Coltrane for just like going off into his own world and getting increasingly esoteric and extreme and exploring his own thing musically, even though, right, like Miles Davis, Miles gets picked on for the way he performs, right? Like wanting to turn away from the audience or something while he's playing so as not to be distracted. He still wants to play for the audience, not for the exploration of like interstellar space or something, which is me getting farther and farther away from the story to talk about jazz. But I think that those metaphors are there, different kinds of approaches to music and wanting to be the best or wanting to achieve for different reasons are going to become questions that we have. To that end, there's nothing more like achievement direct than the competition, which we do get to. And Prender, the band director, ends up getting killed in a car wreck along the way. And the situation is troubling. Lots of weird things happen. I think one of Hannah's real kind of like bits of magic is that it's also somehow hilarious. It's also a moment when we get to see Quadberry leaping into action because he has some sense of who he is and what he wants to do. He's got this show must go on quality. And he knows, in a way that I think of as weird for any person at any age, that he specifically needs to be heard. So that's a lot of different things about humor, but like I'm trying to move us through time and the story a little bit. But what is going on here?
Well, I think the Prender dying on the way to the performance is partly funny because he's hit by an ambulance, which, it just in itself is rather, a wicked way to go, considering that, emergency medical, services are for helping people.
Yeah.
And thus it's like the ironic way that Prender dies on the way to their big performance, because one of the things is this band is really good. Like, it's their senior year, and they're a great band, and they've been outperforming all these other bigger bands than them.
Yeah.
And so, the fact that Prender doesn't get to witness the fruition of this is both, sad, but also the way he goes is pretty funny.
Yeah.
I think as far as Quadberry goes, like one thing that's true about his place in the band is that he's brought on because of Bolero. And he's like, well, partly, I did all this stuff just to do this piece. I'm going to do this piece.
Yeah.
At the other end, there's something about himself that Quadberry is like able to understand but not grasp. In that, like, he plays in a strange way. He like bends way over playing the saxophone and like puts the bell towards the audience. That is an insane thing to do. You can't breathe as well that way.
No, not at all.
And, the other thing is that after they perform, William asks Quadberry about the performance. And Quadberry actually says there was a wizard inside me. It wasn't me playing. There was a wizard like playing for me or through me. Right? So he's aware that there's some sort of extra help given him, that it's not just like he practiced all this and he's amazing.
Yeah.
Like, this is beyond like even the best rendition of Bolero, according to the story. Like, it's better than whatever symphony does this. Like this, particularly the saxophone part.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of led to believe that there is some sort of either supernatural or religious or some sort of mythical way that Quadberry is endowed with in order to play this.
Yeah. This is
right?
the Holy Ghost, right?
Yeah, so it's like this wild thing. And before I forget to add this in, kind of towards the last question we were talking about, testimony also assumes a need to testify. And, right, that's most often used, at least in America, in court cases. And so part of this testification is that, I don't know if that's a word, by the way.
I was thinking out the noun there. I'm not sure, man.
Anyway, part of this testimony, there we go, is that in his life, Quadberry needs to testify this particular feeling inside of him at this moment, this particular skill and ability that he's given somehow. It has to be heard because it's more than life. Like, it's like bigger than life.
Yeah.
And it's not just for Quadberry. It's for everyone to experience like this moment of grace and joy that it doesn't matter where it comes from. It's just like by somehow allowing it in to the world, it makes the world a better place. At the same time, I would just want to say, like, William is, some of the writing is kind of like he's getting questioned by detectives or something, where it's like, well, so how did you first meet Quadberry?
Yeah.
And then he's like, section on meeting Quadberry.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, when did you and Quadberry start hanging out? And then section on when they started hanging out, right? And then, okay, well, then what happened? Like, then that happens.
Yeah, it reminds me a little of Midwife to the Fairies in that way. And also, I don't know if either of you felt this way about the accident, but I couldn't help thinking of Car Crash While Hitchhiking.
Oh, the Dennis Johnson story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to read a few lines from around the accident because they're so funny, and I think us just saying that they're funny and absurd doesn't, per se communicate what's going on here and the pace at which things happen. So here's how we learn of Prender's death. There was a thick fog, a flashing ambulance snaking the lanes, piled into him head on. So just that sentence. Prender, who I would imagine was thinking of Bolero and hearing the young horn voices in his band. Perhaps he was dwelling on Quadberry's spectacular gypsy entrance, or perhaps he was meditating on the percussion section, of which I was the king, passed into the airs of the band director heaven. And then we move to things like, I loved the tough and tender director awesomely and never knew it until I found myself bawling along with the rest of the boys of the percussion. Or, man, you can't play any more than I can direct. You're bawling your face off. Look out there at the rest of them. Man, it's a herd. It's a weeping herd. I think it takes the death of someone who's clearly very important to the narrator and shows us in his voice how this happened, what a strange adventure it was, and manages to not take away the importance of the director as it renders this all so absurd. I think it's also important to touch on the narrator and Quadberry's different reactions to this and how they kind of come close to mirroring each other, but not quite.
Yeah.
So the narrator really wants to play just Bolero in response. He feels like he owes that to Prender, and that's what he wants to do, so he starts to kind of rally the troops to do that and to, make sure people don't go off to have their cry. And at the same time, Prender comes in with what Adam's pointing to is, not Prender, Quadberry comes in with this very strange attitude. He says, I'm directing. I'll be right here in front of you. You look at me. Don't you dare quit on Prender. Don't you dare quit on me. You've got to be heard. I've got to be heard. Prender wanted me to be heard. I'm the star, and I say we sit down and blow. I think for me, like, this takes the narrator's response and escalates it and does something different in that it shifts the focus onto what Prender wants. Is not bullshitty in that way, but also there's an unusualness about his willingness to say so directly, "I'm the star."
Yeah.
I think in terms of manners, like there's a lack of humility there, but he is the star at the same time. It's his attitude toward that stardom and how he goes about reaching for it that, especially in terms of his dialogue around it, seems odd.
Yeah, I think it's that there's something about, right, like rebirth through acts of culture or the extension of life through acts of culture. We'll get into some of the religious stuff, I'm sure, but like where he's keeping Prender alive through Bolero or giving him an opportunity to live through Bolero, and that seems to be part of his like mission, but because he has a mission, it feels really self-indulgent and maybe just selfish, even as it's happening, right? Like, actually, to one of the lines that I think is funniest in this story, right? One of the reasons that Quadberry has to lead the band is because Clinton happens to be sort of adjacent to Jackson, Mississippi, and there's an assistant student director who hypothetically could lead the band if they were gonna like ride this one out. And that guy is immediately on the like human case of like, no man, like this is awful, this thing that just happens. He says this like ridiculous lines like, we got teenagers in ruin, man. Like, so, like, which is so like odd. I think it's that there's that balance between the extremist language that Quadberry is using that's only accentuated by like Hannah's ridiculous attention to like idiosyncratic language even amidst chaos.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that really strikes me about this story and how willing it is to let these boys change over time and not make them into one kind of character.
Yeah.
As you know, earlier, I think we learned so much about Quadberry through the narrator, and especially about how the narrator views Quadberry's music and his relationship to it. He seems to have different language around Quadberry's ability and his way of approaching music that gets a little more specific in terms of his knowledge of Quadberry. And one thing that we get when Quadberry first comes to the band and joins them is this description of him kind of, like Matthew said, kind of stooping with his sax so as to be invisible. And it's as if the music is just there and not Quadberry. It describes him, some of the girls as wanting him to be handsome and him being like neither handsome nor ugly. There's a longer list, but I mean, basically invisible.
Yeah.
And so I think one thing that's really fascinating is moving from that moment to this one and letting those two contrasts live.
Another thing we haven't really discussed is kind of these over or undertones of homosexuality in the story.
Yeah.
And that is played out a bit in the Prender and this young student director who it's kind of inferred the younger student director has fallen for Prender. And the reason he's so upset is that they may have had a relationship or he cared about him so much and hadn't told him. And so that comes out. But also the fact that Quadberry bends over and plays like that is literally described as I thought he had pitched forward off the stage. He went down so far to do his deep oral thing His conducting arm had disappeared so quickly. I didn't know but what he was having a seizure. Right? And so all of that, the earlier thing about protecting the mouthpiece, right? Like all of those things point to the fact that some of this invisibility might have to do with the fact that Quadberry is homosexual, or the people surrounding Quadberry, some of them are homosexual.
Right.
So that's another thing that comes into play here.
Well, and he's, I mean, per the Queerberry thing, right? Like now, right, that's more like, well, it's still a term that people use as an insult, right? Like, and it's pretty aggressive language, not in a space where he can be visible or off the periphery to the like metaphors of the house and all of that. And I think there is something remarkable about, right, and there of course, right, like testimony Pilate, we'll get into this, was obviously like a religious metaphor about Jesus Christ, and I think like I probably never want to read this essay, but there's definitely like there's so many homosexual overtones to a lot of religious stories that involve sort of like groups of men being independent, or to our mutual teacher Fenton Johnson, like a sort of monk's life being metaphorically or literally homosexual periphery often, that don't, and those metaphors don't always come to the surface, but some of what's being thought out is a lot of what those metaphors are about, including through why and how we come to the ways that we think about the things we think about, whether it's race or sexuality. And I'm interested in Quadberry's philosophy. I think it's laid out, and we're also given doubts about it, right? Like in that moment after Bolero, right? Like another band director tells Quadberry that you were big with Bolero, but you don't own the stage, and shoos him away. And then we get more of Quadberry and who he is as a person, right? Like William and Quadberry are about to spend a lot of time together. I'm wondering why we get so little of Quadberry's philosophy, despite the fact that what happens after this moment where the band plays, I mean, they graduate, but then they're professional musicians together for a long time with the band, the Bop Fiends. And why don't we know more about Quadberry? Why don't we know more about the way he thinks despite that?
This is a hard question for me to answer,
Yeah.
but I'm gonna try. I think of this story as one that sort of builds and isn't static and changes over time. I like Matthew's assessment of like the testimony as part of its form, and I mean I think there's a real honesty about how this narrator's looking back on how his attitude toward Quadberry changed over time. I think ultimately, though, like we get to this space where the narrator's writing this story out of nostalgia and, I presume, a little guilt. And also, I think he comes to sort of hero worship Quadberry, and as a narrator, I think in many ways, like what we end up getting about Quadberry are how he reacts to things, and I pay a lot of attention to, like I was saying, like the contrasts between the narrator and Quadberry, like in that moment where Quadberry is called Queerberry repeatedly by a smaller boy, the narrator says, kind of pulling Quadberry off the kid, like, why do you care? And, Quadberry says something dismissive, like, because I do. I think I paid a lot of attention to moments like that, trying to navigate who the narrator is, which I have a much clearer sense of by the end of the story,
Oh, sure.
and who Quadberry is. And I think some of what gives Quadberry this kind of magnetic draw, finally, for the narrator is his talent, um, and also his sort of discipline as a musician. I think it really strikes the narrator that Quadberry responds in a similar way to Prender's death, but has this hardness around the death itself, like he says of Lillian, who the narrator is really infatuated with and, I think loves, in his own words. There are a lot of other things to do when you hear about death. What I did, for example, she ran away, she fell to pieces. I think there's a strength in young Quadberry,
Yeah.
a kind of like stoic quality, and the narrator clearly really cares about music as well. He goes deaf playing the drums. He's playing for girls in sundresses, but he really cares about music and accesses Quadberry often through music. I think the kind of hard lines that Quadberry draws around women, especially when he's younger, that kind of changes a little as he grows. Even his father has a drinking problem, and Quadberry says that he's never going to drink. And I think there's something about like Quadberry's extremism that draws the narrator.
Yeah.
In that way.
One reason I think William doesn't give us a lot of Quadberry's philosophy is that he wasn't paying attention, and that's one of the things he feels guilty about. The way he connected with Quadberry was generally musically, and the fact that Quadberry had access to Lillian Field, who is the girl who, during the performance of Bolero, she goes across the street, after hearing about Prender's death, she goes across the street to a bar, has a couple beers, comes back and watches from the audience, and then comes up and talks to Quadberry afterwards, basically throws herself at Quadberry. And, Quadberry asks William to come with him, to ride in the car back to Clinton, because Lillian's going to be in the car with him, and he does not want to be in the car with Lillian, because she smells like beer. And William literally asks him why. Quadberry says, "To help me get rid of her. Her breath is full of beer. My father always had that breath. Every time he was friendly, he had that breath. And she looks a great deal like my mother." All right, so part of the thing that William's guilty about is that if he does know, he's not telling us. If he doesn't know completely, then he probably never asked.
Right.
And the situation here is that it seems that Quadberry's father is either being too friendly to his mother, or too friendly to his mother and to Quadberry, or just too friendly to Quadberry.
Yeah.
And so this is something I think William feels unprepared to deal with at this time, and probably when he's writing this later. He just doesn't understand it. He didn't have to go through that. And so Quadberry, what he does is part of the music thing is that his mother's a musician herself. And I think, one reason that Quadberry has to play this is that, in some way, he's, continuing to show what goodness came from his mother and, into him. In some strange, I don't know how to put it, but, psychological way. Yeah. And he kind of uses Lillian as a way to make him feel safe, insofar as she protects him from people calling him Queerberry. She's beautiful, according to William, and apparently everyone else. And because Quadberry is with her, then he's more invisible.
Yeah.
And so part of his philosophy is like trying to make it through life and focus on the things he needs to focus on and not think about the things that have happened to him. And, you know, that's part of what we get from William, even if he doesn't really see that.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the, right, like whether or not Lillian's a beard for Quadberry or whether she's, you know, someone who's like facilitating his like ability to carry on life and have a relationship aspect to it without stopping what he needs to do as a saxophone player, as a pilot, what have you, like that relationship, at least for him, is a little functional in that way, and it's a little bit about dealing with whatever is going on in his world and his intensity, whether it's being the child of an alcoholic or being, you know, just a weird kid or being a gay kid or being all of those things. And I think that's a lot of that actually comes out to the women, right? Like, although, right, like it's a very long story. And we don't get that many women. We never actually see Quadberry's mother, although we're told that Lillian doesn't actually look that much like Quadberry's mother, according to William. We get Lillian's sister a little bit, who's going to later have a relationship to William. And we get Lillian, a lot of Lillian. All of them have these kind of adjacent lives to the men, but they are deeply significant to the men in terms of their egos, in terms of how they live their lives, what they build their lives around. I've spent a lot of time thinking out the roles of women in this story and trying to figure out how that works, and some of that can we elaborate on that a little bit? I think Matthew started that conversation really well, but I'm still, I think, trying to work that out for myself a bit.
Well, gosh, the women in this story. I think, as with most things in this story, the way that women get depicted is complicated. I think when the boys are younger, they often look at women as objects, as interchangeable, as, you know, lustful sundresses. So, I mean, with desires their own, but often in these ways that prevent us from really seeing them as unique individuals. So, I mean, I would say, like, to Adam's point, the three characters that we get most significantly are Quadberry's mother, Lillian, and Lillian's sister. Lillian is described with love because the narrator cares for her, and, you know, I think because he also cares for Quadberry and has a certain respect for the two of them as a couple once they become a couple. You know, he promises Quadberry and Lillian. Quadberry comes to the narrator William and tells him in confidence that he believes he and Lillian are in trouble at one point. And it turns out that Lillian actually isn't pregnant, but in that moment, Quadberry asks that William take care of Lillian, sort of gives him that charge as a friend, which I think is the moment that I see as bonding them most significantly, other than the music. And the narrator takes that seriously and exhibits this maturity that we don't see from him earlier in the story as a young boy.
Yeah.
You know, to his credit, but you know, at one point after this comes late in the story, after Quadberry decides to become a pilot. He stops back in Clinton to visit both Lillian and William and gives a message for William, but doesn't say much of anything to Lillian and kind of pushes her out of the plane. Not physically pushes her, but, to her mind, he's rejected her and is sending her some sort of message that he may not be back. And that night, Lillian's confused about what to do, and the narrator offers to let her stay with him. And, out of her grief for this relationship, she comes on to William. And William, even though he's loved Lillian all this time, this is what shows me that the story isn't static and really moves me and draws me toward William. I think, his capacity in that moment to stop and think about how Quadberry would feel about this, how Lillian will feel, to think about something other than just that moment, that act of fidelity is so beautiful to me. I think she's dealt with really tenderly because the narrator has that affection for her. Quadberry's mother we get less of. She appears finally and embraces Quadberry at a time when he's kind of broken from his experience in war, and I think presents as a safe, loving, maternal presence that he didn't expect would be there. Lillian's sister is dealt with a little more problematically.
Yeah.
She's described as, a girl that, God, what is the line? Maybe Matthew can help me. Well, let me summarize, but, oh no, I found it. As a second-rate version of Lillian, as a wayward and overcompensating nymphomaniac.
And
so, no missing of words there. And the narrator does finally marry Lillian's sister, or at least, maybe I'm misremembering, at least...
I think he describes himself as having tamed her. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't think the language is married, but...
I'll give it to you here.
Please.
When I woke up, I didn't have to make my coffee or fry my egg. The girl who slept in my bed did that. She was Lillian's little sister, Esther Field. Esther was pretty in a minor way, and I was proud how I had tamed her to clean and cook around the place. The Field family would appreciate how I lived with her. I showed her the broom and the skillet, and she loved them. She also learned to speak very slowly when she had something to say, because he's deaf.
Right. Yeah.
So,
I like that was the one you were checking the problematic qualities of.
I was. The story's so complicated in that way, though, because I think I think the narrator's relationship to Lillian and how he honors that friendship in that moment really is endearing. But then we land on this note, and he's complicated, he's human, he's sexist.
Part of the reason is, I think, that William is a lusty individual himself, and all he really wants to do is sleep with women. And he doesn't really make bones about that in the story. He just tells you that. But he does recognize this safety and goodness in both Lillian and in Quadberry's mother, which is why he's able to kind of convey that to us.
Yeah.
But also, I think in my reading of the story, I'm not positive Quadberry and Lillian ever had sex. Now, they may have. Quadberry may have, forced himself to do that as an act of preservation.
Yeah.
But also, it's possible Quadberry lies to William in order to try to protect and help Lillian, because he does care for her, just possibly not sexually.
Right.
When William finally gets up the courage to ask Lillian if she's pregnant, Lillian says she wishes she was. There's no, like, you know, I might have been, it was a close call, there's nothing like that. And he's in class with her at the local college at the time, and she never appears to be pregnant to William. And so I think part of me is saddened overly for Lillian in that situation, where while William is protecting the relationship between Quadberry and Lillian might not be getting something she wants.
Yeah. I think that actually one thing that's really tricky about the women in this story, not only because, like, the way that women are talked about is really complicated, is that because we get an opportunity to see William develop as a person, because we've been given an understanding of sort of the world that he grows up in, because we know the kind of, not insignificant metaphor Madonna whore complex that he's like working through, that nevertheless we see William's attempts to try to understand women over time, right? Like, he gets preoccupied. He says this kind of ridiculous parenthetical about, he mentions that he slept with a couple women while he's drumming himself deaf. And, he mentions that he's at least medium handsome, as if to kind of reconvince you of that, and that's why.
In parentheses.
Yeah. And, but he also he goes off on this kind of like sidebar about actually wanting to please the women and worrying about whether or not they had orgasms and self-pitying about not being able to hear that, as if that were the singular indicator of that, right? And all of those things that he's, in his way, right? Like, he's attempting to access the needs of the women in his life. He's attempting to try and be desirable. He's attempting to try and feel and understand and witness them in some way. And he's still failing at it pretty significantly. But that growth and that movement is beginning for him. On the other hand, Lillian's stuck with someone who really is subsumed by someone in Quadberry who, regardless of whether it's about homosexuality or this determined need to achieve, is putting her into his life and using her in his life without giving her a sort of human attention that she really needs, whether that's sexual or just to see her, right? Like, when she sees him on that plane and he flies in to stop and say goodbye, he just says goodbye, and as Ingrid, pushes her out of the plane, and later Lillian's going to die in a weird plane bombing situation. And he doesn't, like with Prender, he responds with awareness of the situation, but not with sort of the devastation that you, if I get blown up in a plane, I want the two of you to cry about it for a day or two, at least, as a courtesy for my ghost,
I'm going to have to practice my weeping.
Awkward silence.
Only because I'm not used to crying for whole days at a time. Can we talk about the message that Quadberry gives Lillian to give to William?
Oh, totally, yeah.
He says, I am a dragon, America the beautiful, like you will never know. Sir, what does that mean to you?
I don't know. I've spent a lot of time with that line. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that line, and the truth is, I have no idea. Here's my current, largely unsupported theory that Quadberry is traveling to the global east. I think that he seems to think that he has a destiny of some kind, like a powerful destiny, right? Like spirits are entering him to play his music. He's got to do these things. He has to be heard. I think he seems to be taking on a more Eastern metaphor about his power and significance through the dragon, but he's doing that using the sort of political military terminology of saying this other thing. I also think that it's totally plausible. I think that that's sort of what Hannah's bringing in. But one thing I'm very much open to in this story is the possibility that the story has clued us in that Quadberry might not be as significant, great, or grand as Quadberry would like to believe Quadberry is, or that William, as someone who has been deeply affected by his time with Quadberry, would like Quadberry to be, right? That he's lionizing this person. I think enigma is a big part of the way that young people, or really anybody, maintain their sense of power. The pretending that I know something you don't know, I have access to something you don't have access to. I mean, there's a read of this story wherein Quadberry's a weird kid who lives with his alcoholic father and who digs on his mother as a person, and practices a lot because he's an alienated weird kid with at least one parent who isn't paying enough attention, who gets really good at the saxophone for Clinton, Mississippi, and who seems very, very impressive at the time, and a kid who wants to be a really good drummer but has his hope shattered not by the realization that he couldn't make it in a larger scene than the South, but by failing to take the warning that he's going to go deaf if he doesn't wear earplugs or take care of himself or take a break from time to time or just use the brushes more. Needs to then lionize the life that he had and tells this story. And so he's latching on to these little pieces of weird enigma laid out by his strange but maybe self-indulgent friend. But I both of those are potentially true to me, but I think the choice to do the I'm a dragon, America the Beautiful, like you will ever know or never know, is lionizing himself, Quadberry lionizing himself. He's using that terminology, and then he's reminding his apostles or acolytes that he just cannot, they can't reach his level yet. He's got a destiny that's bigger than them. I don't know if that's true, but I think it's what's happening in that line.
Interesting. Yeah, I see your point. And I think the lionizing I would agree with the most.
Yeah.
Especially around the storytelling of this. One thing I might suggest that I've thought of is that, first of all, his name's Ard, which is short for Arden, which is a T short of ardent, which is, in our terms, enthusiastic, passionate.
Yeah.
In archaic terms, means burning or glowing. And, the fact that he's this burning, glowing, literally in an airplane that can kill people, lots of people, right? He's been given this ability to have power.
Yeah.
both from the horn, but then in a more international sense, that he is good at, and maybe he even likes doing. But I think it's possible that he realizes that he can be as good at just about anything.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make him special. And he's telling William, look, the U.S. government has given me carte blanche and murder.
Yeah.
And flight and all these things. It doesn't make a difference. Like, America is actually not as beautiful as one thinks. Here we are, like, I'm over here killing people, helping planes get to areas to bomb, right? Like, this is him being like, I've seen the side of power, which I so wanted when I was young, and I have it, and it means nothing. I think that's a possible read.
Yeah. Somehow that depresses me more than my depressing read.
Yeah, I think some of the success of the message is that we don't know definitively. And, I think the narrator's own read is he ends up tying the plane to a dragon to some extent because of what Adam has to say about like Vietnam being in the global east, too, like there were a lot of battles named in like military code name after dragons. So I mean, there's that connotation, and the narrator reads Quadberry as lording, like what he's seen, above and beyond America in the stars above him. But I mean, I think to your point, Matthew, it could go the other way. It almost reads like a schizophrenic's prophecy, too. I mean, there's something a little unhinged about it. So, there's this tendency to wonder, like, after it and to kind of scratch at meaning, but also to maybe question if there is even anything there.
Yeah. And I think part of that, one of the things that I've mentioned repeatedly is that I'm not 100% sure that, like, Quadberry holds up to the legend of Quadberry. And by the way that, like, I'm not 100%, like, I haven't read the Sermon on the Mount lately, but, like, sometimes I'm like, that's an interesting metaphor, but I'm not sure it's, like, applicable to life. And, like, notably, Quadberry is a very successful pilot because of the effort he puts in. And in that way, like, he ends up being a little bit of a John Henry figure, only that, like, at the end of his great task in Vietnam, like, he hurts himself a lot, right? Because he's so determined to do his job exceptionally, he ends up injured, but to drag in one more, like, secondary text, right? Like, he's sort of a Lieutenant Dan figure, right? From, like, he should die doing the task that he's doing, but he doesn't die in war. He just injures himself and becomes a less capable, less, like, version of himself, and that distresses him, like a more pained version of himself. And it's out of that for the first time that he doesn't know what to do, right? That he doesn't go like, okay, I'm going to be like a disabled person, but I'm going to do this in a remarkable way. He worries out his own pain, and he worries out whether or not that's how he should live, even at the risk of his own life. And then turns to William, again, supposedly, because even William gets that question secondhand from Lillian on the phone, if he should go through with a highly dangerous surgery that's got a 1 in 4 chance of killing him. And William goes with yes, without going to the phone or feeling like he should have this conversation. He turns over his own power and his own direction for that first time. I think that's interesting, but it also plays into the Christ metaphors here. And I think that's the one moment where I'm like, I think this story maybe up to the point that happens is maybe more the testimony of Judas than the testimony of Pilate, right? Because of the intimacy between the two people, because William is sort of an acolyte. But can we talk about just like I don't want it to, I didn't want it to be entirely the like biblical metaphors to take over too much, but I think like you can't fully get around it. So why is it testimony of Pilate? What happens there with the play on words, etc.?
Well, admittedly, like I haven't read the Bible in full ever, so I mean my biblical knowledge comes from attending church and as a child and hearsay. So I'm not especially equipped to answer this, but I mean what I do know of Pilate's narrative is that he orders Jesus' death, kind of puts it to the people, right?
Yeah.
And what he feels about doing that. I know the Master and Margarita version better than I know the biblical, unfortunately, or fortunately, maybe neither.
Yeah.
But I mean, like maybe he has feelings of guilt around that. Maybe he has a migraine that day. But I guess I think about the link being most direct in terms of that final scene where Quadberry asks William if he should go with the surgery, and I mean significantly that Quadberry does die. I think it's really interesting as well to think about how this story relates to death throughout, and how humorous the other deaths are, and how we do not end on a humorous note. Like I think that's where I hear the grief and the regret around making the decision that he does. In terms of what points us to this being biblical, we've talked about the early accident and the upturned crown as the shape of Quadberry's injury. You could think of the crown of thorns there. Quadberry's hair is also always described as having this kind of halo about it, so that's also on the page.
That's a little stretch for me. I think it's hilarious, but yes, a stretch.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the narrator's hero worshipping, one thing that's interesting to pay attention to is how he relates to Lillian over time and how he relates to Quadberry. And I mean, he does always describe Lillian and in hyperbolic terms, and at one point even acknowledges that his memory is probably like inflating her. That said, I think when I encounter Lillian on the page, she's one of my favorite characters. I love what she has to say. I think she lives up to his vision for me in a way that I have more questions around Quadberry, but that's distracting from the religion thing, which I think I'm trying to defer to Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's all here. You can track it.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of set up like... as if William were Pontius Pilate.
Yeah.
And was being asked, like it's that situation where Pilate's remembered predominantly for presiding over this one trial and having Jesus crucified. No one cares what else he did at this point. Like it's just like that one thing.
Yeah.
You can find more information on him, sure, but people, like if you're asked a popular question, that's the question.
Yeah.
Who was it? It's Pilate. Okay. And so, I think to your point about the Judas situation, like it's sort of a weird mix here.
Yeah.
In that, right, by telling this story, like it shows in its way, excuse me, it shows in its way how William feels like he's betrayed Quadberry.
Yeah.
He's let him die by choosing this, but like he's maybe betrayed him in a fuller manner than that by not being present or attentive or listening to his needs and what he should be doing as a human. And, Judas's big claim to fame is that he singles out Jesus in a crowd when Jesus is in a disguise. And that's when he's arrested because, they're looking for him.
Yeah.
And, he goes out of his way to point him out to these people. And then he goes to trial, then he gets crucified. It's a little different here, obviously, but I think the crucifixion, if I were to say so in this story, is more like, I didn't do enough, William. I didn't do enough to, attend to my friend.
Yeah.
I wasn't there when he needed me in the ways that he needed me.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a really interesting thing to do. The reason I say the halo thing is a little much is like, you don't need it. I think it's hilarious. I don't think it's necessary.
Yeah, I think one of my own fascinations with the Pilate narrative, and maybe why it works so well, actually in Master and Margarita, is that why the Bible story works so well, why maybe some of the interweaving speaks to some of this, is that like there's a resistance, or the situation sets up the resistance to wanting to be the murderer of Jesus, or wanting that to fall on your hands if you're Pilate, or if you're the Pharisees, or if you're Herod, that everyone takes their turn at trying not to be at fault, and the sort of bureaucratic situation inevitably falls on Pilate as the person, even though some of what we think about Jesus comes through his attempts to say, like, just say you're not the Son of God, man. Which is, we don't have that, but we have a longer story here of interaction, an opportunity for Quadberry to say anything else. And I think that ends up being really interesting and hilarious. And while we're putting Matthew on the spot,
let me say one more thing. Just of note, they're after Jesus for sedition. Yeah. Which, to compare it to this story, the last line in the story is, "That is why I told this story and will never tell another." And it's like the fact that speaking about it by saying anything or saying something that might be wrong or saying that this is not correct or like whatever, right? That's why they're after Jesus.
Yeah.
All right, go for it.
Oh, no, I think that's totally right. While I'm putting you on the spot,
Yippee-skippy.
Those who don't know, Matthew Schmidt
that's unnecessary.
Is the only one among us who has ever lived in Mississippi. I'm going to combine my last two questions so that you have an out here, Matthew.
Excellent.
But tell us about Southern humor, how this fits in the tradition of Southern humor, and the oddity of Mississippi. And I would invite you to point to some of your favorite lines.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'm going to say is that I'm no expert on Southern literature. That's just a fact. I did live in Mississippi for 5 years. And I think considering the place, like one reason I think Southern writers often use humor is that often it feels like you're in a different country than America when you live in the South. And, that has to do with a number of things. Significantly, most everyone knows that the South was,
complex racial history.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Anyway, everything down there is, like, I think of it as a kind of strange place where things move very slowly and people have this outward appearance kind of being very nice and kind and homely and, things like that. And then there's this undercurrent of rage in a way that doesn't always surface. I think, and again, I'm no expert, but there is something about the place where you just want to strangle it and say you can do better.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of writers from the South realize this and use humor to exaggerate in a manner that mirrors how it feels like to be from the South. And in that way, they get to be, playful and have fun on the page while also telling a very serious story. And, the one thing about humor is like, it's funniest when it's the darkest.
Yeah.
But it also is the fact that humor can make you think about things. Like, why is this funny? Why do I think this thing is funny? And, if you think about comics, a lot of them talk about death.
Yeah.
Because it's like the ultimate ending. And so why is Prender's death so funny? Well, it's the end, man. And it's over. And the fact that it ironically happens is, the coup de grace, so to speak. But if you go look at Southern writers, I think Ingrid's going to talk to us a little bit about Flannery O'Connor. But, you can go there. You can go Eudora Welty. Mark Twain's considered a Southern writer at this point.
Yeah.
William Kennedy Toole has a magnum opus on New Orleans that is ridiculous, but, a really funny and heartbreaking story at the same time. I don't know. I don't know that answers your question necessarily, but I think it's a weird combination of influences that has made the South the South.
Yeah, I think I don't want to miss an opportunity to utilize the fact that you spent some time there, but I've been thinking a lot about, I was telling a friend who got an MFA in Georgia about reading this piece, to which she told me that Flannery O'Connor didn't read as funny to her when she was living in Georgia because it felt too real or something. Whereas I spent a lot of time giggling at Flannery O'Connor because of the absurdness. But to that point, I see Ingrid has brought some Flannery O'Connor to talk about. So.
If I'd had time, I would have reread this book before coming. It's been a long time and it's fabulous. Flannery O'Connor has a book of essays called Mystery and Manners that really explores regionalism and Southern writing in particular, often through talks that she gave. And for fun, I pulled a little bit of O'Connor for us. The country that the writer is concerned with in the most objective way is, of course, the region that most immediately surrounds him, or simply the country with its body of manners that he knows well enough to employ. It's generally suggested that the Southern writer has some advantage here. Most readers these days must be sufficiently sick of hearing about Southern writers and Southern writing, and what so many reviewers insist upon calling the Southern School. No one has ever made plain just what the Southern School is, or which writers belong to it. Sometimes when it is most respectable, it seems to mean the little group of agrarians that flourished at Vanderbilt in the 1920s. But more often the term conjures up an image of Gothic monstrosities and the idea of a preoccupation with everything deformed and grotesque. Most of us are considered, I believe, to be unhappy combinations of Poe and Caldwell. And, the whole book is like that. She has the tongue that she has.
Yeah.
But I think is smart in that she really recognizes in the course of this book the importance of attention to particular customs and manners and habits of speaking. and at the same time is really resistant to classification. And, I was joking with Matthew before sitting down to this, that even to generalize about Faulkner would be really hard for me. You'd have to tell me which book, and even then, getting very specific about his style and his humor.
The Reavers is not Absalom at all.
Right. So, I think there are general things we could say about humor in the South and how it functions, but I don't know. I think of Hannah as his own strange animal, and I think, Adam, you kind of, in this drive-by way, asked about favorite lines in this story, and I was trying to think a little bit about why it is that the lines in this story that would feel too much to me in other stories really land for me in this one. And I think it actually kind of goes back to that mystery of manners, Flannery O'Connor concept. I think the overstatements really land, and the lines I like best tend to have some sort of observation built into them that's a little funny to me. One that I pulled was Quadberry had played his tune on the sax, Radcliffe had played his tune on the mud grenade. It was just a shame they happened to cross talents. Where that comes in the story is very funny. It's a funny way of looking at what's just happened. And I think the cross talents thing would be too much for me in another writer's hand, but Hannah is so evenly too much and not too much that, for me, he pulls it off. Another one I pulled that's much flatter is, to me, it's interesting that I kept to be average and did it all deaf. Though I know this isn't interesting to those who aren't deaf. There's something so funny to me about that observation that he's stopping to think about, the fact that that's compelling to him, but wouldn't be to someone else. Yeah.
Well,
What are some of your favorites, Matthew?
Some of my favorites are before Radcliffe is scared of Quadberry. He's working on becoming a good cartoonist. And he even once asked Quadberry what his opinion was of his future as a cartoonist. Quadberry told Radcliffe that if he took all his cartoons and stuffed himself with them, he would make an interesting dead man.
just brutal. How about you, Adam? Did you pull any?
Man, I already shared my favorite line, which is the teenagers in ruin thing. Mm-hmm. I think it's so perfect. I think that's what I like about Hannah most, is his ability to that thing about Flannery O'Connor might not be as funny in the South, is to stay within the context of the story, to utilize someone's idiosyncratic voice or way of talking, and to let it land and function in the story, to your point, Ing. But to just take it to some weird place and point out how because we all say stuff like that, right? That makes no sense at all if you just filmed it.
Or, sometimes things that make incredible sense in this case. One of the first things I heard about this story, I was walking around Tucson with my friend Mike Powell, and he was talking about loving Barry Hannah, and he quoted this line for me off the top of his head. In Mississippi, it's difficult to achieve a vista. And thinking that was significant, I think we were also talking about Clarice Lispector, who's wonderful in a very similar way. She has a line about taking tremendous effort to achieve simplicity. And, I think what an incredible line that is, and what an accurate one, too.
Yeah.
All right, I got one more.
All right.
Lillian, the stewardess, was killed in a crash. See right there, as if we'd forget who Lillian was.
Yeah.
This late in the story.
Yeah.
Lillian, the stewardess, was killed in a crash. Her jet exploded with a hijacker's bomb, an inept bomb, which wasn't supposed to go off, 15 miles out of Havana. The poor pilot, the poor passengers, the poor stewardesses were all splattered like flesh sparklers over the water just out of Cuba. A fisherman found one seat of the airplane. Castro expressed regrets.
Yeah, I love that as the ending of that.
Yeah. Which I think is the perfect place to say that, like, Hannah's a hard read. He challenges a lot of what's comfortable, and what's great about him is that he gives us an opportunity to laugh at the terrible. I hope you go dig on some Hannah and feel better about the world as a result. Thanks for having this conversation with me, guys.
Thanks, Al.
Thanks, Adam.